How far would you go for beauty? Would you spend a fortune? Or would you sell your soul for the sake of eternal youth? In the early 1600s, at the misty and unreachable peaks of the Carpathian Mountains, Čachtice Castle rose with its massive stone walls. Even today, it plays host to silent screams carried by the wind and the scent of dried blood. In those days, behind these gates, one of Europe's most noble, educated, and enchanting women ruled this fortress. However, beneath her silk dresses and diamond necklaces, she hid a monster. Behind her porcelain skin and noble stature, she concealed one of the most depraved and darkest minds history has ever seen. Her name was Elizabeth Báthory, but the world knows her by a single name that causes a shudder: the Blood Countess. Was the bone-chilling legend that has spread from ear to ear for centuries true? Could a woman truly bathe in the blood of more than 600 innocent young girls for the sake of unfading beauty? Or was this one of the largest and most ruthless political conspiracies in history? In a moment, we will learn not just the life of a serial killer, but the step-by-step transformation of power into madness and pride into pure brutality within those damp and dark corridors. If you're ready, we are opening the most sickening, terrifying, and mystery-filled pages of history, because the truth is even darker than the most horrific legends. When Elizabeth Báthory opened her eyes to the world on August 7, 1560, in the town of Nyírbátor, Kingdom of Hungary, she was born right at the heart of one of Central Europe's greatest power centers. The Báthory family was a dynasty known for its wealth, producing kings and princes. However, beneath this magnificent heritage lay a heavy and cursed shadow that had persisted for centuries. In that era, nobles frequently resorted to consanguineous marriages, marrying relatives, to keep power, wealth, and land within the family. The fact that Elizabeth's parents were first cousins left her not only with noble blood and vast lands, but also a genetic burden lurking in the depths of her mind. Historians argue that this lineage formed the basis for many mental afflictions in Elizabeth, ranging from violent epileptic seizures to uncontrollable outbursts of rage and schizoid tendencies. While young Elizabeth received a stupendous education, becoming fluent in 5 languages and one of the brightest intellectuals of her time, she also came face to face with the raw brutality of the age very early on. 16th century Hungary was a violent geography where wars, beheadings, and public executions were commonplace. Watching a man being sewn into the abdominal cavity of a live horse for theft, and meeting this atrocity with laughter as a young child, was the first sign of an irreversible fracture in her conscience. In her world, violence was not an end to be feared. It was coded as the most natural and magnificent expression of authority and absolute power. In the year 1575, at just 14 years old, Elizabeth married Count Ferenc Nadasdy in one of the most magnificent weddings of the era. Ferenc was no ordinary nobleman. He was a warrior who had earned the title the Black Knight of Hungary for his strategic intelligence and boundless cruelty on the battlefield, becoming a nightmare for the Ottoman armies. This strategic marriage brought Elizabeth Čachtice Castle, an isolated fortress deep in the woods where she would dedicate the rest of her life and eventually transform into an empire of fear. However, their marriage turned into a dark and sinister alliance rather than a classic romantic union. During the rare times he returned from war, Ferenc shared with her a mastery of cruelty that defied human understanding. They engaged in chilling practices that transformed the castle's halls into a place of absolute dread. Whether exposing the innocent to the unforgiving cold or using fire as a tool of fear, Ferenc showed her that power was more than a title. It was the absolute control over the spirit of another. He was the first to nurture the shadows within Elizabeth, teaching her that the suffering of others could be a source of twisted pride and a dark form of satisfaction. With the death of her husband in 1604, the final social restraints on Elizabeth's life were completely dissolved. She was now 44 years old, a widow, the owner of an unimaginable fortune, and an absolute power figure who answered to no man. But the real great transformation began with the arrival of a mysterious and sinister woman named Anna Darvolja. Anna, whom the public whispered about as a witch practicing the dark arts, took Elizabeth's sadism to the next level. If Ferenc taught her how to inflict pain, Anna showed her that killing had a ritualistic and almost religious pleasure. Victims were no longer dying sudden deaths from momentary outbursts of rage. They were being dragged toward death slowly through systematic sessions lasting for days in the damp dungeons of the castle. Elizabeth chose her victims from the helpless peasant girls on her own lands, covering up their disappearances with lies of cholera or sudden outbreaks. As the screams within the castle mingled with the fearful whispers of the peasants outside, Elizabeth Báthory had completely lost her humanity, sinking into an irreversible darkness. When Elizabeth Báthory is mentioned, the iconic and horrifying image that comes to modern culture's mind is a woman entering a marble bathtub filled with the blood of virgins. According to popular legend, the blood of a servant splashed onto her hand, and she noticed that the area miraculously rejuvenated. However, historical facts and court records paint a much more sickening and raw picture. Not a single sentence regarding a bloodbath appears in the archives. Elizabeth's true depravity was her insatiable hunger for the raw pain at the moment the blood was shed and the sounds the victim made while agonizing. Witnesses of the time described with horror how the castle floors were covered in so much blood they couldn't be cleaned, how Elizabeth personally bit off pieces of her victim's flesh, and how she stitched the girls' bodies with massive needles like a piece of fabric. She did not use blood as a cosmetic product, but as a byproduct of her sadistic passions that suppressed her inner void and fear of aging. The bloodbath story was likely added years later to dramatize her monstrous nature, yet the facts were already blood-curdling enough to push the limits of the human mind. Elizabeth's greatest mistake was her boundless narcissism and pride. Peasant girls were no longer enough to satisfy her savage appetite. She sought a nobler, purer pain with higher resistance. Through a fake finishing school she established, she invited the young and beautiful daughters of lower-ranking noble families to the castle under the promise of receiving an aristocratic education. But when the children of noble families began to die suddenly, one by one, and bodies began to overflow from the castle walls, the kingdom could no longer remain silent to this scandal. At the same time, Elizabeth had lent large sums of money to the Habsburg dynasty and the king himself. For King Matthias II, eliminating Elizabeth was not just about providing justice, but also a golden opportunity for the state to escape this massive debt burden. When political games, financial interests, and real bloody atrocities converged, Elizabeth's supposedly eternal immunity began to crack. On that ominous New Year's Eve of 1610, when György Thurzo and his armed men conducted a surprise raid on Čachtice Castle, the scene they encountered surpassed the most horrific depictions of hell. Right at the entrance of the castle were fresh corpses rendered unrecognizable by torture, and in the dungeons were young girls agonizing with their bodies riddled with holes. Despite being caught red-handed, Elizabeth hid behind her nobility and tried to shift all the blame onto her incompetent and sadistic servants with icy coldness. Under torture, her servants confessed in court that the number of victims exceeded 600, detailing the death lists Elizabeth personally kept and how this brutality had become a daily routine in the castle. While her accomplices were executed by being burned alive or having their fingers torn off, Elizabeth was exempted from these public punishments because she carried noble blood. However, the final decision for her was perhaps heavier than dying 1,000 times. Elizabeth was imprisoned in a windowless and narrow room within her own castle. The doors and windows of the room were walled up with heavy bricks, leaving only a small hole through which a guard could provide food. For 3.5 years, she lived in that absolute darkness, alone with only her crimes and the shadows of her victims' imaginary screams. Far from feeling remorse, she continued to see herself as a betrayed victim. One morning in 1614, she was found lifeless on the floor by guards, with ice-cold hands and shallow breath. As if even the earth did not want to accept this woman in peace, she was removed from the church cemetery due to public outcry and buried in an anonymous grave, the location of which remains a mystery today, into the forgotten darkness of history. What was the primary reason for Elizabeth Báthory's transformation into a monster? Perhaps it was the wounds opened in her soul by the atrocities witnessed in childhood, perhaps the genetic devastation brought by generations of consanguineous marriage, or perhaps the dangerous and intoxicating poison that absolute power creates in the human mind. All these pieces combine to form one of the most terrifying and tragic portraits history has ever seen. Her story is not just the dark biography of a serial killer, but also the most concrete proof of how much uncontrolled power, fear of aging, and a pride that has completely lost its conscience can degrade a human being. The Blood Countess died, but the misty and cold walls of Čachtice Castle will continue to hide that dark secret and the cries of the innocent forever.